In video number 9, we're going to talk about another part of speech that we haven't touched on yet, and that part of speech is pronouns, and this one is very, very important. I put it up there with verbs in terms of how many times they ask questions that relate to pronouns. Maybe not as much as verbs or maybe sentence structure, but pronouns certainly are very important on the SAT. Now, in this video, I'm just going to talk about the basics of a pronoun, what it is, and we'll discuss the personal pronouns. In later videos, I'm going to talk about things like relative pronouns, indefinite pronouns, pronoun agreement, all that kind of stuff. So let's get started. What is a pronoun? Well, a pronoun is generally, now this isn't always the case, but this is the general definition, a word that replaces or refers back to other nouns. So we'll do another, where did my ink go? Hello, there we go. Another noun in the sentence or paragraph or essay or whatever. So what would be examples of this be? Let's say we're writing a paper or an essay about Bob. We wouldn't want to repeat Bob, 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 Bob in every single sentence. Stylistically, it would not. Grammatically, it's fine, but stylistically, it doesn't doesn't sound very good to the ear. So what we do is we replace it with pronouns such as he. When we talk about ourselves, we use the personal pronoun I. So these are examples of what we can call personal pronouns, and they are words that just replace other nouns in the sentence. Now, I'm going to talk more about pronoun case in a later video, but I do want to introduce the fact that there are two forms of these personal pronouns. The first is when the pronoun is acting as the subject of the sentence, or is the thing that's doing an action. Remember we talked about subjects versus objects. This is called the nominative, and again I'll go into more detail on this in a later video, but the first person is I, first person singular, so here's the singular, here's plural. Second person is you, third person is he, she, or it, right? I walk, you walk, he walks, she walks, and so on. First person plural is we walk. Second person is you. We don't really, English doesn't have a difference between second person singular and second person plural. It's just you. Sometimes you'll hear people say y'all, and that's trying to be kind of second person plural, but it's non-standard. Anyway, third person would be they, so they walk, blah, blah, blah. Okay, sometimes, though, the pronoun is going to act as the object, or the thing that receives the action. So this is going to be what's called the accusative case, or object case, whatever. You don't need to know this specifically, you just need to know. So for instance, if it's he hit me, right, it's not he hit I, it's he hit me, first person singular. He hit you, so you stays the same. He hit him, her, and it stays the same. How about first person plural? He hit us, not we. You, again, stays the same. So you can tell that really second person we don't really care about, and they're not really going to test that because there's nothing to test. It always stays the same. And then finally, he hit them. Okay, so those are your personal pronouns, and again, the form that they take depends on how they're being used in a sentence, and in case, we'll talk about how you might see that being tested on the SAT. But let's look at some sample sentences where pronouns are used. So for instance, John bought his mother a house. Now, this is not, of course, in the form that we've seen it before. We're going to talk about this a little in the next video, possessive pronouns, but you can still see that this his is going to refer back to John in this case, or at least we think it does. Of course, pronouns are often dependent on the context of paragraphs and of essays and larger bodies of text. But for the purpose of the SAT, we always want to know what is the pronoun referring to in the sentence. So most of the time, the antecedent doesn't necessarily have to be in the sentence itself. I mean, sometimes it doesn't have to be. A lot of times it's going to be. But for the SAT, the antecedent of the pronoun must be in the sentence. Oh, I didn't mention antecedent, did I? Okay, so the noun that's being replaced is called the antecedent. Oops. That's just the kind of fancy word for it. Okay, so the antecedent here is going to be John, right? Because his is going to refer to John. We could write as well, John bought John's mother a house, but you can kind of tell that's clumsy and awkward, which is why we use the pronoun. Another sentence would be, after the storm, we had to clean up the yard. Now note, we here is not referring to anything specific in the sentence, but it does have an antecedent, right? Let's say we were made up of John, Mary, and I. I could write, after the storm, John, Mary, and I had to clear up the yard, but again, that's awkward and long. We can just replace that with we. So in the case of we or I, the first person, there's not necessarily an antecedent, but it's an implied antecedent, right? It's replacing me and other people, or just me, or whatever. Okay, one last sentence. Generally, when pronouns are used correctly, you don't really notice them because that's the point of them. They're supposed to replace a word and not really draw attention to themselves. We're going to see in later videos when they're used incorrectly. But one other example I want to show you is this one. Here's actually an example where we have an issue with the antecedent. So, Mr. Brown and Mr. White spent all day admiring his car. So, in context, perhaps the sentence would make sense, right? We would know who was the person who had the new car. Or let me add new here, actually. New car. We would know from the sentence who had the new car. Or, we would know from maybe the paragraph or the story or whatever whose car this was, and maybe the sentence wouldn't be such a big of a deal. But even then, we still have some ambiguity within the sentence itself. Again, here's our pronoun. It's a personal pronoun, but it still matters in this case. So we have this personal pronoun, his, but the question is, what is the antecedent? Is it Mr. White? Or is it Mr. Brown? Unclear. This is an example of an error you might see on the SAT. It doesn't come up that often, but it does appear. It's called an ambiguous pronoun. Or an ambiguous antecedent, I guess would be more accurate. Right? It's the idea that we don't know what exactly in the sentence this pronoun is referring to, what the antecedent is. Therefore, if this were, say, an error ID and this were underlined, you would pick this as your error because technically you've got to specify. You probably have to, if you were to rewrite this, it'd be something weird like spend all day admiring Mr. Brown's new car. It's not great, but maybe you could rewrite the sentence in another way to be a little bit more clean. But in any event, the point is that this pronoun is ambiguous and therefore it's wrong. Okay, so in later videos, I'm going to go into much more detail on pronouns because this is just the tip of the iceberg. So let's move on to pronouns and possessives.